"That wall," she said, pointing a perfectly manicured but somehow threatening finger, "is an eyesore and a violation. Section C, paragraph 4 of the Whispering Pines Covenants clearly states that all property line demarcations must be of uniform white vinyl construction. You have 90 days to bring it into compliance, Mr. Vance." Her name was Carol Covington, and she was the self-appointed queen of this manicured suburban fiefdom. She stood on the edge of my property line, a place no Covington had ever stood, flanked by two other members of the HOA board who looked like nervous, doughy bodyguards. Her voice was pitched to carry, a performance for the benefit of any neighbors peeking through their blinds. She considered this a display of power. She was wrong. This was an act of trespass. I looked from her strained, smiling face to the wall. It was made of fieldstone, pulled from this very land 250 years ago by my ancestors. It was 4 feet high, a foot thick, and ran the entire 1,000-foot length of my northern property line. Moss grew in the crevices, and lichens painted century-old patterns on the stones. It was a monument to persistence, a testament to the fact that my family had been here long before Whispering Pines Estates was a developer's fever dream. It was my history. She saw it as a compliance issue. "That wall," I replied, my voice calm and even, "is not coming down." Carol's smile tightened. It was the first time, I suspect, that she had ever received a direct refusal. She was used to cowed homeowners and mumbled apologies. She was not used to a flat, emotionless denial. "I don't think you understand," she said, her tone shifting from imperious to condescending. "This isn't a request. It's a formal notice of violation. Fines will accrue daily after the 90-day remediation period. If they remain unpaid, a lien will be placed on your property. We have the authority." She had no idea. She stood there in her pastel pantsuit, armed with a 3-ring binder and an unearned sense of supremacy. And she had absolutely no concept of the ground she was standing on or the man she was speaking to. She thought she was a queen enforcing her decree. In reality, she was a child kicking a hornet's nest, assuming the buzzing was applause. I had spent 20 years in the Air Force as a combat controller, directing airstrikes and coordinating operations in places that don't appear on maps. My entire career was built on assessing threats, gathering intelligence, and executing plans with overwhelming, disproportionate force. Bureaucracy was just another battle space, and Carol Covington had just declared herself a hostile combatant. "I understand perfectly," I said. "You believe you have authority over this land. You're mistaken." She let out a short, sharp laugh. "Oh, I'm not mistaken, Mr. Vance. You'll find out. 90 days." She turned with a theatrical flourish, her acolytes trailing in her wake. She thought she had fired the opening salvo in a war she was destined to win. This was her first fatal mistake. She assumed the war was about a stone wall. I was about to make it about her entire world. The first notice arrived a week later. It wasn't sent via certified mail, which was amateurish. It was a flimsy piece of paper stuck to my front door, detailing the violation and the accruing fine of $50 per day. I took a high-resolution photograph of the notice on my door, with the time and date stamp enabled. I then carefully removed it, placed it in a plastic sleeve, and opened a new file on my computer. The folder was labeled Operation Overlord. The first document saved was exhibit_A_improper_notice.jpg. My home office, which overlooks the stone wall she so despised, became my command center. For my first 2 decades of adult life, I had planned operations that dismantled insurgent networks. Now, I was applying the same principles to a homeowners association. The objective was not defense, It was not compliance. It was total victory. The first phase of any campaign is reconnaissance. I needed to know my enemy, the terrain, and the rules of engagement. I started with the Whispering Pines covenants, conditions, and restrictions, the document she had quoted at me like scripture. I read all 112 pages of it, twice. It was a masterpiece of petty tyranny, filled with rules about mailbox colors, lawn height, and the permissible number of decorative gnomes. It also detailed the procedures for violations, fines, and liens. Her procedures. The procedures she had clearly violated with her first notice. According to her own Bible, all official correspondence had to be sent via certified U.S. mail. Strike one. Next, I began a passive surveillance campaign. I installed a series of discreet, weatherproof security cameras covering the perimeter of my property. Not the cheap consumer-grade junk, but high-definition, night-vision-capable units that fed into a secure server in my basement. Any future visit from Queen Carol or her minions would be documented in crystal-clear 4K video and audio. Her second mistake came 2 weeks later. She appeared at my property line again, this time with a contractor. I watched them on my monitor. She was pointing at the wall, gesturing wildly. The contractor was shaking his head. My parabolic microphone picked up snippets of their conversation. Structurally sound? Historical. Can't just tear it down. Carol was not pleased. "Your job is to give me a quote, not an opinion," she snapped. The encounter was saved as Exhibit B Conspiracy to Damage Property.mp4. This was the point where a normal person might have hired a lawyer. But my background was anything but normal. Before I was a combat controller, the Air Force sent me to law school. I was a member of the Judge Advocate General's Corps for 6 years, prosecuting and defending military personnel. I knew the law. More importantly, I knew how to build a case. A lawyer would send a letter. I was building a fortress of evidence from which I would launch an offensive. I drove to the county records office the next morning. It was a dusty, quiet place that smelled of old paper and fading ink. The clerk was a kindly woman named Marge, who looked like she'd been there since the county was founded. I requested the plat map for the Whispering Pines Estates subdivision, recorded in 1988. Marge returned with a massive, rolled-up piece of vellum. I unrolled it carefully on a large table. There it was, a sprawling map of 200 lots, all neatly numbered, with streets and common areas clearly defined. And there, on the northern edge of the development, was my property. It was outlined with a thick, dark line, and inside the outline were 2 words written in the elegant cursive of the original surveyor: excluded parcel. My land was never part of Whispering Pines. It had been explicitly, legally, and publicly recorded as separate from the subdivision over 30 years ago. The HOA had as much jurisdiction over my stone wall as they did over the surface of the moon. But I didn't stop there. My family history wasn't just a collection of stories. It was a paper trail. I asked Marge if they had records dating back further. Much further. She led me to a climate-controlled vault. And there it was, a sheepskin document, brittle with age, the ink faded but still legible. It was a land grant from His Majesty King George III, dated 1765, granting my ancestor, Captain Elias Vance of the Colonial Militia, 300 acres of land for his service in the French and Indian War. The grant was recognized and incorporated by the Commonwealth of Virginia after the Revolution, and my family had held title to this core, 10 acres of it, ever since. My property didn't just predate the HOA, it predated the United States of America. I had a certified, notarized copy made of the original plat map and the King's grant. These became Exhibit C Plat Map 1988.pdf, and Exhibit D Royal Land Grant 1765.pdf. The foundation of my case was no longer just strong, it was absolute. Carol Covington was threatening a property that was, in the driest legal sense, sovereign. If you've ever had to deal with a petty tyrant who bit off more than they could chew, you know the quiet satisfaction that comes from discovering the perfect weapon. Hit that subscribe button and follow along, because you are going to want to see how a 250-year-old decree from a dead king dismantles an entire suburban empire, piece by meticulous piece. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and maybe share a story about your own brush with a power-tripping board member. With the legal status of my property confirmed, I shifted to the next phase: intelligence gathering on the enemy's command structure and internal weaknesses. I began to investigate Carol Covington herself. Public records are a powerful tool for those who know how to use them. Property records, business filings, court records, it's all there. Carol and her husband, Bob, lived in the largest house in the development. They had purchased it in 2005. I pulled the HOA's annual budget reports for the last 15 years, which were a matter of public record for any homeowner. I started a new spreadsheet, cross-referencing expenditures with vendor names. A pattern began to emerge. The landscaping contract for all the common areas, a hefty $60,000 a year expense, was held by a company called Covington Lawn and Garden, LLC. A simple search of state business records revealed the owner, Gerald Covington, Carol's brother-in-law. The contract had been awarded without a competitive bidding process, a direct violation of the HOA's own bylaws. Then there was the line item for community management consulting, for $30,000 a year. The recipient was a firm called Strategic Solutions Group. The address for this firm was a P.O. box in the next town over. It took a bit more digging, including a subscription to a professional database service I still had from my Air Force days, but I found the sole proprietor of Strategic Solutions Group. It was Carol Covington. She was paying herself $30,000 a year from the HOA coffers to consult on her own management. This wasn't just a violation of bylaws. This was wire fraud and embezzlement. The fines she collected from residents for trivial violations, nearly $40,000 last year, weren't going into a community improvement fund. They were being funneled into a slush fund labeled Legal and Enforcement Contingencies, the same fund she was using to pay the HOA's lawyer to send threatening letters to residents. The same fund she was undoubtedly planning to use to try and put a lien on my property. She wasn't a queen. She was a crime boss running a protection racket. The stone wall was never the issue. The issue was my refusal to bend the knee. My property, a 10-acre island of independence, was an intolerable affront to her absolute control. She needed to make an example of me. This was her third and most critical mistake. She had escalated the conflict from a civil dispute into a criminal conspiracy. My operational plan now had two prongs. The first was the civil front, a quiet title action to get a court order officially declaring my property immune from the HOA forever. The second was the criminal front, a meticulously compiled dossier to be delivered to the State Attorney General's office. But before I launched my offensive, I needed allies. An insurgency of one is just a target. A coordinated resistance is a revolution. I started walking the neighborhood in the evenings. I didn't need to look for her victims. They were easy to spot. I saw Mr. Henderson, a retiree in his 70s, painstakingly measuring his lawn with a tape measure. I struck up a conversation. Carol had fined him $200 because his grass was, in one spot, a quarter of an inch over the 3-inch maximum. He was terrified of losing his home, the one he'd shared with his late wife. I listened patiently, then told him I was looking into some irregularities with the board and asked if he would be willing to provide a copy of his violation notice. He agreed, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. I spoke with the Miller family, who had 2 young boys. They had been fined $500 for their basketball hoop, which Carol deemed aesthetically displeasing. They had taken it down, but the fine remained, accruing interest. They showed me the threatening letters from the HOA's attorney. My most heartbreaking conversation was with a widow named Mrs. Gable. She was a sweet, elderly woman whose only joy was her small garden. Carol had initiated proceedings to fine her for excessive and non-conforming lawn ornamentation, a collection of ceramic gnomes her grandchildren had given her. She was in tears as she told me the story. To each of them, I made the same offer. I have a legal background, I told them. I believe the board is acting outside its authority and may be mismanaging funds. I am preparing a formal complaint. Your story is important. If you allow me to, I will include your case in my report, and I will represent our collective interests at the next annual meeting. There will be no cost to you. Over the course of 2 weeks, I identified and met with 15 families, 15 victims of Carol Covington's reign of terror. Each had a story of petty harassment, exorbitant fines, and the constant fear of losing their homes. I collected their documents, scanned them, and organized them into my master file. Each family became a file, a narrative, a piece of the mosaic of corruption I was assembling. Exhibit_F_Henderson_testimony.pdf. Exhibit_G_Miller_correspondence.pdf. Exhibit_H_Gable_photographs.pdf. The list grew, a testament to her widespread abuse of power. The fear that had isolated them began to transform into a quiet, simmering anger. For the first time, they realized they were not alone. Our quiet insurgency was born. We had a secure email group for communication. We had a strategy. We had a leader. The balance of power in Whispering Pines was beginning to shift, and the Queen had no idea. With my allies secured and my evidence compiled, I moved to the legal offensive. I drafted the quiet title complaint myself. It was a 20-page document that laid out the indisputable history of my property, citing the 1765 King's Grant, the 1988 Plat Map, and the relevant state property laws. It was a surgical instrument designed to legally sever my land from the HOA's grasp permanently. I filed it at the county courthouse and paid the fee to have the HOA formally served by a sheriff's deputy. The day the deputy served the papers to Carol at her home was, according to my neighbor's subsequent text message, a sight to behold. She reportedly turned a shade of crimson that clashed horribly with her beige pantsuit. Her illusion of absolute authority had been challenged not with a phone call or an angry email, but with a legally binding court summons. She had been punched in the face with a stack of paper. Simultaneously, I prepared 2 other packages. The first was a formal, multi-page cease and desist letter addressed to Carol and the entire HOA board. It was sent via certified mail, with return receipt requested. In it, I detailed their campaign of harassment, the invalidity of their jurisdiction over my property, and cited the specific state statutes they were violating regarding trespass and intimidation. I demanded they immediately retract all fines, cease all contact, and issue a formal apology. I gave them 10 business days to comply, after which I would pursue civil damages. The second package was much thicker. It was the dossier. It contained copies of everything: the HOA's doctored maps versus the official plat map, the bank statements, the evidence of the fraudulent landscaping and consulting contracts, the sworn affidavits from the 15 families I had organized, the photos, the video, everything. It was a comprehensive, undeniable narrative of racketeering, embezzlement, and fraud. I bound it in a professional black binder with a simple cover page. For the attention of the Economic Crimes Unit, State Attorney General's Office. I sent it via courier with signature confirmation. The 10-day deadline I gave Carol in the cease and desist letter came and went. Her only response was to double down. Through the HOA's lawyer, she sent me a letter dismissing my quiet title action as frivolous and threatening a countersuit for maliciously attempting to undermine the authority of the Whispering Pines Homeowners Association. The letter also informed me that the board had voted to accelerate the lien process on my property. She was predictable. A cornered animal doesn't reason, it lashes out. This was her fourth fatal mistake. Her threatening legal letter, a clear act of retaliation, was immediately scanned and forwarded as a supplement to my file with the Attorney General. Exhibit_Q retaliatory legal threat.pdf. She was building my case for me. The annual HOA meeting was scheduled for the first Tuesday of the following month. Her letter had confirmed my intelligence. She planned to use the public meeting to hold a vote to authorize the lien. She intended to humiliate me, to make me an example in front of the entire community. The agenda, which was mailed to every homeowner, listed Vote on Enforcement Action for Property at 1 Old Mill Road as the headline item. She was staging her own public execution. She just didn't realize who was walking to the gallows. In the weeks leading up to the meeting, my insurgency worked in the shadows. We used our private email list to coordinate. The 15 families I had united spoke to their neighbors, sharing their stories not of fear, but of impending justice. The narrative began to change. People who had been too afraid to speak up started asking questions. Whispers of mismanagement turned into open discussion. The ground was being prepared. The day of the meeting, I received a call from a senior investigator at the Attorney General's office. His name was David Chen. He was calm, professional, and direct. "Mr. Vance," he said, "we've reviewed the materials you sent. It's one of the most well-documented civilian submissions I've ever seen. We have opened a formal investigation into the financial activities of the Whispering Pines HOA board. The evidence of embezzlement and fraud appears to be substantial. We are coordinating with the district attorney's office. I understand there is a general meeting tonight?" "Yes," I replied. 7 p.m. at the community clubhouse. "Excellent," Chen said. "My team and I would prefer to handle this discreetly, but given the upcoming vote on your property, we feel a public intervention may be necessary to prevent further illegal action. We'll be in the area. We'd appreciate it if you could text me if and when the board initiates the vote you mentioned." "I can do that," I said. The trap was set. The hammer was ready to fall. All Carol had to do was walk into it, and I knew, with absolute certainty, that her arrogance would not allow her to do anything else. The community clubhouse was packed. More people were in attendance than for any meeting in the last decade. The air was thick with tension. My 15 allies and their families were scattered throughout the room. A silent, coordinated network. I sat in the front row, alone. I had a laptop bag at my feet. Mrs. Gable gave me a small, encouraging nod from across the room. I gave her a slight smile in return. Carol Covington sat at a long table at the front of the room, flanked by her 2 board cronies. She looked radiant, powerful, dressed in a sharp red blazer. She was a queen holding court. She scanned the crowd, her eyes finally landing on me. She gave me a smirk of pure, triumphant malice. She thought this was her moment of victory. The meeting began with mundane business. The minutes from the last meeting, the treasurer's report, a work of complete fiction, which I now knew was designed to hide her theft. Then she arrived at the main event. "And now," she announced, her voice resonating with theatrical gravity, "we move to the matter of the property at 1 Old Mill Road. As you all know, we have an owner, Mr. Elias Vance, who believes he is above the rules that govern the rest of us." She gestured toward me. "He has refused to comply with a simple, reasonable request to remove a dilapidated and non-compliant wall. He has ignored our notices. He has accrued thousands of dollars in fines. He has even filed a ridiculous, baseless lawsuit against the association." A murmur went through the crowd. She paused for effect, letting the weight of my alleged transgressions sink in. "The board therefore moves," she continued, her voice rising, "to authorize our legal counsel to place a priority lien on the property at 1 Old Mill Road for the full amount of the unpaid fines, plus legal fees, and to proceed with foreclosure, if necessary." This was it, the moment she had been building toward. She looked at me, expecting me to shout, to object, to make a scene. I did nothing. I simply watched her. My stillness seemed to unnerve her more than any outburst could have. "Is there any discussion before the vote?" she asked, her gaze sweeping the room, daring anyone to challenge her. I slowly raised my hand. A flicker of annoyance crossed her face. "Yes, Mr. Vance? Do you have something to say before we formalize your debt to this community?" "I do," I said, standing up. "I have a short presentation, if you'll permit me the use of the projector." This was unexpected. She hesitated, but denying me the chance to speak would look weak. "Fine," she sneered. "You have 5 minutes. Let's hear your excuses." I walked to the front of the room, opened my laptop, and connected it to the projector. The first image that flashed onto the large screen behind Carol was a high-resolution satellite photograph of the neighborhood. A bright red line was drawn around the 200 homes of Whispering Pines. My 10-acre property was noticeably outside that line. "This," I began, my voice calm and clear, amplified by the clubhouse microphone, "is Whispering Pines Estates, as defined by the official plat map filed with the county in 1988. I clicked to the next slide. It was the surveyor's map, with the words "excluded parcel" circled in red. As you can see, my property was never incorporated into this development. The HOA has never had any legal jurisdiction over it. Not now, not ever. The murmuring in the crowd grew louder. Carol's face, projected in shadow on the screen, began to lose its triumphant glow. "Any fines or violations issued against my property are legally void," I continued, my tone that of a lecturer, not a defendant. "But the issue of jurisdiction is, unfortunately, the least of this community's problems." Next slide. A scanned image of the King's Grant from 1765. This is the original title to my land. It predates this country. While largely a historical curiosity, it establishes a chain of title that is legally unbroken and incontestable. To challenge it is to challenge the very foundation of property law in this state. Carol was on her feet now. "This is absurd. He's trying to distract you with irrelevant history. We have bylaws." "Let's talk about bylaws, Carol," I said, using her first name for the first time. I clicked again. A spreadsheet filled the screen. It had columns for dates, vendor names, invoice numbers, and amounts. According to Bylaw 7.2, all contracts over $5,000 require a competitive bidding process. The landscaping contract, for $60,000 a year, has been held for 9 years by Covington Lawn and Garden. a company owned by your brother-in-law, Gerald. Here are the state incorporation papers. Slide. The incorporation documents for her brother-in-law's company. And according to Bylaw 9.4, no board member shall receive compensation for their services, which makes this $30,000 annual payment to a consulting firm called Strategic Solutions Group very interesting. Slide. The incorporation documents for her own shell company, listing her as the sole proprietor. And even more interesting is that the payments to your company, Carol, were made from the account where you deposit the fines you levy against residents like Mr. Henderson for his grass being a quarter-inch too long, or Mrs. Gable for her grandchildren's garden gnomes. The room was dead silent for a moment, and then it erupted. People were shouting, pointing at Carol. Her face had gone from crimson to a pasty, sickly white. Her two board members were slowly pushing their chairs away from her, as if her corruption were contagious. "Lies! These are all lies!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "This meeting is over. The vote stands." "I don't think so," I said quietly into the microphone. I took out my phone and sent a single pre-written text message. "Now!" As if on cue, the main doors of the clubhouse swung open. Two men in dark suits entered, followed by several uniformed state police officers. The lead agent, Investigator David Chen, held up his badge. "Carol Covington," he said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "We are investigators from the State Attorney General's office. We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of embezzlement, mail fraud, and wire fraud." The color drained completely from Carol's face. She looked like a ghost. She stared at Chen, then at me, her mind unable to process the complete and total reversal of her reality. She had walked in here a queen, ready to banish a troublesome peasant. Now, she was a criminal in handcuffs. The officers were professional and efficient. They cuffed her, her red blazer looking garish and absurd under the fluorescent lights. They read her Miranda rights in a calm, steady voice that echoed through the stunned silence of the room. Her two board cronies were read their rights as well, one of them looking like he was about to faint. As they led her away, her eyes met mine one last time. There was no anger in them, no defiance, only a hollow, bottomless well of shock and incomprehension. She still didn't understand what had happened. She had started a fight over a stone wall, and it had cost her everything. She had no idea who she was dealing with, not from the beginning. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Carol Covington, faced with a mountain of undeniable evidence, took a plea deal. She pleaded guilty to felony embezzlement and was sentenced to 3 to 5 years in state prison. She was also ordered to pay restitution of over $400,000 to the Whispering Pines HOA. Her house went into foreclosure to cover the debt. The Queen lost her castle. Her two board members also pleaded guilty to lesser charges and received probation, community service, and were permanently banned from ever serving on a corporate board again. The state's investigation led to the HOA being placed into temporary receivership. A court-appointed manager took over, invalidated every fine Carol had ever issued, and refunded the money to the residents from the recovered funds. The fraudulent contracts were terminated. The bylaws were rewritten to ensure transparency and prevent any such abuse from happening again. 6 months later, a new board was elected. Mr. Henderson, the man once terrified over the length of his grass, was the new president. Mrs. Gable was in charge of the Architectural Review Committee. Her first official act was to declare garden gnomes a protected class of lawn ornament. The Miller family's basketball hoop went back up, and the sounds of their children playing became a welcome fixture in the neighborhood. The reign of terror was over. A community that had been fractured by fear was slowly beginning to heal. My quiet title action was granted in a summary judgment. The judge's order was simple and absolute. The property at 1 Old Mill Road was legally and historically distinct from the Whispering Pines subdivision, and no HOA would ever have any claim or jurisdiction over it, in perpetuity. I had the order framed and hung it in my office. Life returned to the peaceful rhythm I had sought when I first moved here. The cameras came down. The files were archived. The command center in my office went back to being a quiet place to read. The war was over. I had won. Sometimes, in the early morning, I walk the length of the old stone wall. I run my hand over the cool, rough stones my ancestors placed here centuries ago. It's more than just a wall. It's a boundary, a line between my world and the one outside. It's a symbol of the simple, profound truth that a person's home should be their sanctuary, a place of peace, safe from the petty tyrannies of the world. Carol Covington tried to cross that line. She tried to tear down my history to satisfy her ego. She learned that some lines should never be crossed, and some old walls are built on foundations far deeper and stronger than she could ever imagine. Justice isn't always a thunderous explosion. Sometimes it's a quiet, methodical campaign. Sometimes it's the slow, relentless pressure of well-organized paper. And sometimes it's the sweet, silent satisfaction of watching a tyrant's meticulously constructed world crumble to dust, leaving behind nothing but the quiet peace they tried so hard to destroy. The wall stands. I remain. And the pines whisper in a neighborhood, finally at peace.